The chapel doors slammed shut with a bang as the guards burst in. Torches lit up the altar, and one of the guards shouted, "Stop!" The prince stood up too abruptly, his hands trembling. Standing next to him was his sister in a habit, a young nun, her face white. One guard grabbed the prince by the shoulder and dragged him to the exit. Another approached the nun and said coldly, "You left your cell after lights out. Explain yourself." The sister lowered her head and folded her hands silently. The prince tried to speak, but the guards did not listen. One of the novices whispered, "What happened?" Only footsteps and orders could be heard. The guards took the prince to his chambers and left the nun under supervision in the convent. After this incident, the royal court demanded an explanation. The chancellor came to the convent and demanded a clear explanation. The Mother Superior replied calmly, "He was seeking advice from Sister Helena." The chancellor looked at the prince and asked sternly, "Why are you here after lights out?" The prince, Aldrich, said evenly, "I was seeking an answer to a question about duty and justice." His voice trembled, but he did not lie. The chancellor did not smile. He said, "Night meetings with novices are unacceptable. This will be investigated." The monastery promised to cooperate, and contact was temporarily prohibited. Aldrich went to his quarters, and Helena was left in her cell under supervision. Elena was young and quiet. She had taken her vows 3 years ago and tried to take them seriously. She was appointed a mentor on spiritual matters because people came to her for advice. Aldrich came to her in the mornings and afternoons, first as a teacher, asking about morality, reading prayers, asking for explanations. He asked difficult questions about power and conscience. She answered simply, without complicating matters. The meetings were short and businesslike until the day he came at night. The night alarmed everyone, because people do not always see the truth in it. After the scandal, the monastery tightened its rules. The Mother Superior spoke quietly to Elena. "What happened between you?" Elena replied calmly, "He asked for advice." I answered. The mother listened and did not rush to conclusions, but her eyes were tense. She understood that the reputation of the monastery was at stake. Elena tried to hold on, but at night she found it difficult to sleep. She understood that the prince's gaze was becoming longer, that he was waiting for her words not only for the sake of learning. She tried to reject the thoughts that came to her, because she had made a vow before God and before people. Aldrich felt the pressure of the court. He was being prepared for the throne. He saw lists of duties and listened to the advice of his elders. But those duties did not provide answers to his questions about fear and doubt. He would come to Elena and say, "I'm afraid I won't be able to cope. I don't want to harm the people." She would reply quietly, "Do what is right. Listen to the people. Take steps carefully." His eyes lingered on her face longer than the conversation required. Once he said directly, "You help me not to lose myself." She turned away and replied, "I only guide. Iam anun. We must be careful." They began to communicate more often, but cautiously. Aldrich wrote her notes, short and to the point. She replied precisely and matter-of-factly. These notes became a bridge across which their thoughts passed. In the cell, they sat side by side, reading texts, discussing ethical issues, but sometimes their hands touched each other accidentally, while passing a page, with the help of a candle, and both withdrew. They did not put their feelings into words, but they knew that something was changing between them. One evening, when disease had come to the city and the court was tense, Aldrich entered the cell without knocking. He sat down and said quietly, "I can't pretend anymore." Elena looked at him and asked, "What do you want?" He replied directly, "I want you to be close to me, not just as a mentor." She pulled away. "I have taken a vow." His gaze became determined. "I know. I am not asking you to break your vow. I am asking that we be honest with each other." She was silent and looked at his face for a long time. Then her lips moved. "If I break it, I could be severely punished. Do you understand that?" He took her hands gently, as if holding a fragile promise, and said, "I understand. I fear for you." The cell was quiet. They talked about things that could not be said aloud in public. They discussed their fears and the possible consequences. Aldrich talked about how he would live without the throne, if necessary. Elena thought about how the church treated those who broke their vows. She remained silent. They knew that the path they envisioned for each other was fraught with risk. Several novices helped them secretly. They brought candles, closed the cell door, and pretended not to notice anything. One of them, Sister Maria, was young and loyal. She quietly passed notes and accompanied Aldrich's departures. She believed she was acting out of kindness. But in a monastery, there are always those who watch more closely. One of the guards noticed that the notes were coming and going more frequently. His name was Gilliam. He was quiet, but he liked having power through information. He began to watch. Meanwhile, Elena and Aldrich's relationship grew closer. They took their time, but every glance, every cough, every word carried weight. They laughed quietly when they could, argued about books, argued about justice, and in the argument their voices softened. When someone came in, they embellished their conversations with quotes and stale arguments to hide their feelings. They taught each other things that were not included in the state statutes: patience, trust, the ability to listen and admit mistakes. They grew closer not only through words, but also through duties. He brought her books and papers. She taught him to remain silent at the right moments. But whispers had already reached the city. People noticed the warm glances and brief encounters. The chancellor said to the king, "We must keep an eye on them. This could harm the dynasty." The king nodded and remained silent. He did not want any noise in the crown. The monastery was also nervous. The Mother Superior called Elena and said bluntly, "I need you. Your honor is my honor. Do you understand?" Elena nodded, but her eyes were tired. She understood that it would be more difficult from now on. She understood that even if they were able to hide it now, tomorrow someone might come along who would decide to tell the truth. On the eve of an important council meeting, Aldrich came to her and said, "I am ready to do anything to protect you." She looked at him and replied quietly, "I am not asking you to ruin your life for me." He sighed and took her hands. They held each other in silence, and that silence spoke louder than words. They knew that ahead of them lay not only trials, but also choices that could change their lives forever. Several months passed. Their meetings continued secretly, but they were no longer just words. They knew each other better. How each slept, how they smiled, what words hurt. Aldrich came in the morning and in the evening, sometimes under the pretext of reading, sometimes for a short visit between errands. Elena fed him tea, gave him scrolls, and they sat next to each other so that no one noticed. Their hands sometimes touched, their shoulders touched, and it gave them the feeling that they were not yet lost in a world of rules and regulations. One evening, only Sister Maria remained in the cell. She brought a lamp and quietly closed the door. Elena placed a cup of warm milk in front of Aldrich. He took it and reminded her, "You look tired." She smiled in a monastic way, "Tired from work. But I am with you." He spoke again of fear. "I hear people whispering. They look at me differently." She lowered her eyes. "We need to be careful. But it's hard for me to pretend that I don't care about you." He sighed. "I'm not asking you to renounce me. I'm asking you to be with me when I can." She placed her hand on his palm and said quietly, "I'm afraid." He squeezed her hand. "I'm afraid too." Day after day, they learned to hide their feelings behind ordinary conversation. When someone entered, they talked about the writings of the Holy Fathers, about justice, about decrees. But more often they were silent and listened to each other's breathing. They exchanged notes, which Sister Maria hid in a bunch of grass near the cell. And these notes were simple. "I think about how you talk at night," Aldrich wrote. "I think about how you look at people," she wrote. They rarely spoke aloud about the future, because words seemed like thunder that could destroy fragile walls. Gilliam increased his surveillance. He walked past the cell more often, stopping at the window and watching when the light in the room went out. He noticed that Aldrich now came and went quietly, without an entourage. He saw Sister Maria carrying bundles. He made notes and began to discuss his observations with one of the junior guards, hoping for encouragement. His speech was simple. "I saw suspicious movements near the cell. There is something that needs to be reported." He felt he was doing his duty. One night, he was spotted. It happened like this. Sister Maria was passing a candle. Aldrich was leaving to return to his quarters, and Gilliam, who was hiding around the corner, stepped forward and shouted, "Halt!" People turned around, the door flew open, and in that moment, the cell was filled with guards. Aldrich tried to speak, but he was seized, and his voice was cut off. Helena stood up and said quietly, "They are mistaken. We were praying." One of the guards, the one who had seen Gilliam's notes, walked around the room and found one of the notes rolled up in a corner. He unfolded it and read aloud, "I think about how you speak at night." Everyone froze at once. The chancellor received an urgent messenger. The next morning, the court gathered for questioning. The questioning was short and harsh. Aldrich stood before his father and the council. His face was pale, but he spoke honestly. "I was looking for advice and comfort. I didn't want to deceive anyone." The chancellor crossed himself and said, "This is not a bad joke or a lesson. This is a matter of honor and order." The king was silent and looked away. The Mother Superior came and said evenly, "If a sister has broken her vow, the convent will answer for it." It was a standard statement, but her voice trembled. Elena was brought to shame. She was forced to kneel before the bishop. He asked, "Do you admit that you had a relationship?" Elena raised her head and said quietly, "I remained silent. I know that many will decide that I have sinned. I am responsible for my actions." Her voice trembled, but there was no retreat in it. After the hearing, it was decided that the prince would be removed from public affairs pending clarification, and the monastery would investigate the offense. The people were reassured with words about the good of the crown and honor, but in the dark rooms, the conversations were different. If this is true, the consequences will be dire. If it is a lie, who stands to gain from spreading it? Aldrich was stripped of some of his privileges and forbidden from entering the monastery. Helena remained in her cell under supervision, and Sister Maria was forbidden from leaving the monastery. The situation was getting worse. They tried to communicate through trusted intermediaries. Aldrich wrote notes, which he hid with the mason at the gate, and in one of the notes he wrote, "I will not give up. I will resolve everything if I can." Elena replied, "I am holding on for us." These words gave them strength, but time was working against them. In her cell, Elena began to hide her face in her hands more often. She asked the Mother Superior if she could take on quieter duties so that her days would be filled with work, but the mother often looked away, not wanting to open her heart. Surveillance intensified. Constant visits, questions, checks. It was eating away at their strength. One day, after weeks of tension, Elena felt a sudden weakness. At first, she thought it was fatigue. Then she felt sick while eating and realized that something was wrong. She met Sister Maria in the bathroom and whispered, "I need to know the truth. I'm afraid." Maria brought an old woman who knew the signs. The woman held her hands and said, "You may be pregnant. You need to check quietly, otherwise there will be questions." Elena fell onto the bench and cried. She thought about punishment, about what Aldrich would say, about what would happen to him and her. She feared for her life and for his future. She couldn't tell him right away. In the convent, such news would spread like wildfire. She thought about running away, about hiding and giving birth somewhere far away. But escape meant leaving behind the church and the people she was connected to. She thought about how Aldrich, deprived of his rights, would not be able to help. She thought that if she were accused, she could face death. She was not thinking only of herself. She was thinking of the child she did not want to lose. Aldrich did not learn of her condition right away. He received a message from Mary, written in simple words. "She asks for you." He came at night, when the guards were on duty at the entrance. Elena was sitting on a bench, and her eyes showed determination mixed with fear. He sat down next to her and took her by the shoulders. "What's wrong?" she whispered. "I think I'm pregnant." His hand trembled. He stood up abruptly and took a few steps, then returned and sat down. He spoke quietly. "If this is true, we must act wisely. I will do everything to protect you and the child." Elena looked at him and said bluntly, "How? You are already under surveillance. You have been stripped of your rights. If they find out, they'll come for me." He lowered his head. "Then we must think about secrecy. We must hide this at all costs." They began to make a plan. First, they would hide the signs. Elena began to wear loose clothing, work more, and spend time with her sisters in the garden to explain her fatigue. They agreed that no one would know. Aldrich wrote letters asking for help to those he trusted, to some old friends of the family. He looked for ways to move Elena to a safe place under the guise of a pilgrimage or medical treatment. They discussed the risk, and every time someone looked in their direction, their hearts sank. But the chances were slim. People in the royal household were beginning to talk about punishment, and rumors were turning into plans. Gilliam was already gathering facts and looking more confident. They understood that if they were caught, it would not just be a scandal. It would be the end for both of them. They both knew the price and accepted it. They chose secrecy. They set about their task, not promising each other complete salvation, but promising one thing: to do everything to keep the child alive. The night was tense. Aldrich and a few people he trusted prepared for the move. Maria pretended that Elena was going on a pilgrimage at the abbot's request. They gathered warm clothes, old scrolls, and a little money. Elena remained calm, but her hands trembled as she packed her things into a bag. She looked at Aldrich and asked quietly, "Are you sure this will work?" He took her hand and replied, "I'm not sure of anything. But if we stay, they'll catch us. I'll do everything I can to get you out." He looked tired, but there was determination in his voice. Elena nodded and tied a scarf around the bag. They went down to the monastery basement, where two women were waiting to take Elena away, pretending she was going to the house of a deceased relative. Everyone acted quickly and without words. Aldrich led the way. Maria walked ahead with a lantern. They walked along quiet paths, bypassing the guards. Soon they were at the garden, where a horse-drawn van was supposed to be waiting. As they approached, Gilliam emerged from the shadows. He held a parchment and smiled the way people with power smile. "What are you doing?" he asked calmly. For a moment, everyone froze. Aldrich stepped forward. "We're leaving. It's Mother's request." Gilliam shook his head and said, "Mother didn't ask. I saw you gather. I am obliged to report it." In the darkness, Maria moaned. Elena looked at Gilliam and said quietly, "Why did you do that?" He looked straight into her eyes. "I serve order, and I want a better life. I will receive a reward for what I am about to say." His voice was cold. Aldrich tried to grab him, but Gilliam had already stepped back and shouted, "Guards!" The guards were quick. They surrounded the courtyard and brought people with torches and keys. Aldrich tried to resist, saying, "Take yourselves away, it's Mother's order." But the guards did not listen to him. One of them grabbed Elena by the elbow and led her to the houses. Maria screamed as she was dragged away. Aldrich broke through to Elena and tried to pull her out of his grasp, but the guards used force and dragged him away. He shouted, "Let her go. You have no right." He was pushed to the ground and tied up. Elena looked at him through the line of people, her lips moving, but she could not shout any more warnings. In the morning, they were taken to court. People watched. The chancellor stood with the documents, the bishop beside him. Aldrich stood in chains and said quietly, "This is unfair. She helped me. I love her." His words spread throughout the hall. Some people whispered, others craned their necks to hear better. Helena stood in a gray robe, her face pale. The bishop asked, "Have you broken your vow?" She replied calmly, "Yes. I have broken my vow of chastity." Her voice was without guilt or praise. "Name the father," asked the bishop. She was silent for a long time, then said quietly, "I will not name him." There was a rustle in the hall. The chancellor said sternly, "If you do not name him, the court will pass judgment without leniency." Aldrich realized that it was time to act. He stood up and, despite his chains, approached the table. He looked at everyone and said, "I am the father. I confess. Take the blame on me. I renounce my rights to the throne if that is what it takes to save her." His voice was clear. The chancellor looked at him and said coldly, "This statement must be formalized. Do you understand that you are risking everything?" Aldrich replied directly, "I understand." The trial continued. The witnesses were sworn in and the documents were checked. In the end, the decision was made. Elena would be deprived of communion and sent to public penance. She would be excommunicated from society and confined to a special house of penance, where her life would be supervised by the church. Aldrich was deprived of some of his rights as heir, and was given a choice. to renounce his claim completely or remain a disputed heir. He silently signed the papers of renunciation. Elena was taken out to the square at night. A crowd gathered. She was placed on a wooden platform and ordered to say in front of everyone, "I have sinned." She uttered the words evenly, without pleading. People threw stones, shouted and spat. This is how repentance is done, to show the power of order. Her hands trembled, but her voice was calm. After her repentance, she was taken to the house of repentance. Aldrich stood at the edge of the square and watched as the woman he loved was led away. His eyes seemed empty. In the house of repentance, Elena saw those who had been there at the beginning. Work, prayer, strict routines. She lived in a small room with closed doors. The sisters brought her food, and the doctors watched over her. She realized that her child would be born here. Thoughts about what would happen to him kept her awake. She wrote notes to Aldrich and hid them in flasks, which were then taken by one of the monks loyal to her. He took the notes to Aldrich, but not openly. They were delivered in secret. Aldrich went into exile. He traveled far away, lived modestly, worked on a farm, but thought of her every night. He sent messengers, paid for the secret maintenance of the starving, and paid people who promised to remain silent. But money could not buy all hearts. The highest-ranking people in the crown laughed at him and whispered, "He is losing his mind for the sake of love." He understood that he had made his choice and had no regrets, but remorse came at night when he was alone, counting the stars and thinking about the child. In the house of repentance, Elena gave birth. She was alone at the moment of delivery, with only the doctor and the senior nurse by her side. The child was born healthy. Elena held him to her chest, cried quietly and whispered, "You are mine." But her joy was mixed with horror. If the truth came out, it would be a disaster. They agreed with the doctor and the senior nurse that the child would be given to one of the peasant families loyal to the monastery to raise. His future would be hidden. He would be given a simple name, so that no one would suspect anything. Elena reluctantly agreed. She understood that if the child stayed with her, she would attract attention, and it could cost both the child and Aldrich their lives. She gave her son to a woman who was willing to hide the truth. Time passed. The child grew up in another family far from the court. He was fed and educated, but no one knew his origins. Aldrich sometimes secretly saw his son when he brought him things. These meetings were short and silent. He smiled and said little. "Be kind. Remember your mother's name." The child did not understand everything, but he felt the warmth of the man who came. Elena heard about the child through rumors and the pleas of the ambassadors. She knew he was alive. It gave her meaning. But their secret could not remain a secret forever. One of those who had been given money came and demanded more. He said he would reveal everything if he was not paid extra. Aldrich gave him all he had, but the man demanded a larger sum. In the end, he went to the chancellor and told him the truth, that the nun had given birth to a child, and that the prince had renounced his claim. The chancellor listened and said, "We must act cautiously." He understood that if the truth came out to the general public, it would undermine confidence in the crown. But he also saw an opportunity. The child could be declared illegitimate and hidden among the peasants. Soon, the crown partially forgot about the matter. The people at court were busy with new affairs. Aldrich lived in the shadows, Elena in silence. The child grew up to be hardworking and obedient, but at times he asked questions about his origins. He did not know his father's name, nor did he know about the palace. He grew up with simple values: hard work, truth, honesty. Aldrich and Elena could only watch from afar. Years passed. Aldrich aged faster than many of his peers. He often visited the house of repentance, sometimes bringing books, sometimes leaving bread. He saw how Elena was aging from the burdens of life, how her face was losing its youth. They rarely had long conversations. In their brief encounters, there were many words that needed no explanation. They held hands and remained silent. They knew that their choice had changed many destinies, but they did not regret their love. Eventually, as generations of children came and went and the crown changed hands, their story became a quiet legend. Some spoke of them with condemnation, others with understanding. The child grew up and one day learned the truth about his origins. He came to the monastery, read the old records, and understood who his parents were. He did not come with vengeance. He came with a request. "Tell me, why did you hide the truth?" Elena, tired and quiet, replied. "We protected you as best we could." Aldrich, old and gray-haired, said, "I chose to love. It was my decision." The child listened silently, and in his gaze there was both grief and understanding. The story ended not with a storm, not with the thunder of punishment, but with quiet acceptance. People argue about who is right, but those who knew them personally remembered that love and duty sometimes conflict, and that people who step into the forbidden pay a high price. Elena died in a house of repentance many years later. Aldrich died in a modest house in exile. Their son lived his life knowing his truth, and sometimes brought flowers to the old walls of the monastery where it all began. He did this not for glory, but because he understood the price of the decisions that had been made for his sake.